Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Stock Market Today. It's Alissa, Coram, and Justin Nielsen here on this Tuesday. Another strong day of gains. Justin, why don't you go ahead and give us a preview of the stocks we're going to be analyzing?
Today's program is sponsored by the letter L. So we're going to be talking about Lowe's. We had strong retail sales, so we'll mention Lowe's. We'll also get into some of the chips, Lam Research in particular, and also we'll wrap it up with Eli Lilly, which was soaring on some cancer data news.
Well, I love it. But first, let's take a look at the Nasdaq here, up about 1.8% for the day. The S&P 500 up 1.9%. The Nasdaq up 2%. So following on strong gains that we had in Monday's session, and you mentioned a strong retail sales report.
Yeah, that kind of started things off. There was a May retail sales saw a 17.1% jump according to the Commerce Department. The expectation was for a 7.5% increase, so that was a big beat there. On top of that, in the pre-market, you also had news coming out of the UK that there was a steroid that looked, pretty promising in terms of the treatment for COVID-19, and that it had lowered the mortality rate. So that's potentially good news for the COVID-19 front. And then, of course, you had a strong move at the open. The fact is, it's always tough when you get such a strong gap up like that. But the fact is we held those gains for the most part. We did test it. You can kind of see the intraday chart there. That's when Powell was speaking. He started speaking around 10 o'clock Eastern time, 9 o'clock. What time was that? 7 o'clock Pacific time. And whenever Powell speaks, there's a lot of uncertainty that can, go, and a lot of dicing of his words.
Yes, hanging on to every word.
Right. What the Fed is going to do, and should the Fed be doing more? How much is Congress going to do? And so that whole fiscal policy discussion. But the fact is, we did hold the majority of the gains. So while we did test, kind of that gap, we closed strong in the about 69% closing range. So that's well in the upper half, and a strong follow-up to yesterday's reversal. Recall that yesterday we undercut the lows of the previous Friday, and really closed strong. And so it was good to see that we were able to follow up on those gains today.
Yeah, it definitely was. And now let's take a look at some individual stocks, starting off with Lowe's, ticker LOW. Investors liking the sound of strong retail sales, and Lowe's gaining over 3% today. Looks like a nice rebound after a little handle type pullback here.
Exactly. And so, not only are we sponsored by the letter L, but it seems like we're going to be sponsored by reversals, because that's a lot of what we're seeing. And it makes sense because you had the Nasdaq composite coming down to its 21-day. Again, we talked about this last week. This is something that we were expecting. We didn't expect it to come down that quickly, but it was a nice place for it to get support, and it really reacted very well at that support level. And so now what that does is it kind of carries over to a lot of stocks where you see them pull back to some logical areas of support and potentially get, rebounds from there, reversals. And so that's what we kind of saw. It started with lows yesterday. Again, you can kind of see that it tested those lows of the previous 2 days, and then came really strong, closed at the peak yesterday. And so today was just kind of a follow-up move. Of course, they also did have an upgrade to boot in addition to the retail sales report, and that upgrade was from Credit Suisse. I think it was moving at the price target from 140 from 130.
All right, and it closed today around that 132 mark. So just something to note, even though we take those analyst upgrades with a grain of salt, but it can have provide catalysts for stocks.
Right,
so.
and on the same note, the downgrades too. A lot of people get concerned when they see their stock downgraded, and the reality is you have to really just look at the chart, because a lot of times you have to understand what the analysts are doing as they're making some moves based on valuations. They're putting things into their model and saying, okay, whether something is overvalued or undervalued. And on that note, let's go ahead and move over to the chips.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's exactly what was going on in the chips today. Morgan Stanley was basically shifting their chip focus away from some of the leaders like NVIDIA, and to some of the stocks that had been maybe not participating as much, like Lam Research. And so you have a lot of setups that we've been noting lately, Teradyne, monolithic power, there's these chips that were seeming like they were being left behind, but now they're participating. And so that's where, sometimes these analysts are, kind of changing their valuation models and favoring some of the stocks that weren't as extended in price, because, they're looking at PE ratios and things like that. Now, we don't pay that much attention to PE ratios and valuations. We're really looking at the chart and looking for that leadership. But the fact is, LRCX, is showing a nice pattern here. Again, this is another reversal where we saw that, nice test yesterday of the lows, really kind of, finished strong at the peak. And so today was a follow-on. And then, of course, you hit that century mark of 300. You got back above that level. And those century marks can often be an important level psychologically. Once you get above there, it can usually, power ahead further.
Yeah, and last but not least, let's check in on Eli Lilly, ticker LLY. Big gain today, up 16%. This is on our long-term leaders list, but I will say, out of this somewhat messy base, it ended up being a little disappointing. But do you think today's move is potentially a game changer here, putting it squarely back on the radar?
Well, and this is the trick with anything that is dealing with drugs, medical. There's so many things that can come out. Let's say the study had kind of gone a different way. You could only imagine what would have happened to the stock price. And so sometimes with the long-term leaders, what we're doing is we're trying to give these room a lot of times, because they can have these overall big moves. And if you switch to the monthly, you can kind of see how these are the ones that, you kind of fall asleep and you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I actually have made a lot of money on this. So the patience really pays off in this case. And so Eli Lilly, if you were doing a position trade, you might have gotten shaken out of that position. I know I did. I wasn't able to hold on to it. I was, kind of shelling out some of my shares because of what was going on the last few days, kind of trying to reduce exposure. But this is one where if you had just kind of held with it, as long as you weren't more than 7 to 8% below your purchase price, which if you bought right, you wouldn't have been below 7% or 8% below your purchase price, you could have held on to this and participated in this. Now, again, you never know when this data is going to come out. In this case, it was a combination therapy with their drug Verzenio. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but it helps reduce the recurrence of breast cancer. And so this is a very positive thing. And so that's why you're seeing a big move in the stock. Now, if you are trying to buy it now, it's probably out of there. It's too late. We really avoid buying things extended. But if this is something that you held on to, then you're really seeing the benefit. And so again, as you mentioned, long-term leader, it's a great place to look for some of these ideas that you can hold on to for a longer period of time and not worry so much about these wiggles and wobbles.
Right. Now, quickly, with these medical stocks, could you treat a gap up like this on a piece of news somewhat like you could treat an earnings gap?
Yeah, I would say that you could if you're in one of those areas that's a logical buying place anyway. So in this case, because you did get the pullback, and you're seeing a reversal, I think you can still, kind of sneak in there as close to the open as possible and kind of ride it and, see if you can get a little bit further gain out of it. But it's very, you don't want to be doing that on stocks that are already extended, that have already been moving. You have to have some logical place that it's gapping up out of, usually a point of resistance. So even this is a little unusual to do the gap up off of a kind of a reversal. It's usually those points of resistance that you're crossing that you'd be, employing that strategy. But I'd say, in some cases, you can still use that for the reversals as well.
Well said. And we'll have to leave it there for now. One thing's for sure, we will definitely keep it on our radar. And that is it for this show. But we do have a webinar, I believe, coming up at 2 p.m. Pacific.
That's right.
We teased it a little bit this morning on IBD Live with O'Neill portfolio manager Charles Harris and the Market Smith crew talking about home run stocks. That's got to be a pretty interesting webinar.
Yeah, and I mean, Charles Harris, he's been at this for over 20 years. He and I used to sit next to each other. So his style is different from a lot of us, and it kind of just shows you how you can be using CanSlim and the IBD style in a lot of different ways. And so it's always interesting to hear his take on things because he does things a little differently. And he's had a lot of success, though. So it's worth watching.
Yes, make sure to check that out. If you go to investors.com/webinar, you will be able to access it from there. And I mentioned IBD Live. That's our morning live stream where our experts are sharing their screens, answering some of your questions in real time, talking about setups that we're seeing. We looked at this one earlier today, and it's just a really great place to make sure that you're getting that expert perspective and not, having knee-jerk reactions when we do have tests
Right.
we recently saw with the market down to that 21-day line.
Well, and even today, we were talking about the expectation of, potentially filling in that gap that we saw this morning.
Yeah.
And it really kind of did exactly the ideal scenario that Mike Webster laid out in the
Yeah.
morning. It kind of followed that to a T. Now, of course, we were kind of saying, if this happens, then you do this. If this happens, then you do this. But it at least helps you really kind of come up with your plan for the market.
That scenario analysis each day is very key. So check that out at investors.com/IBD Live. All right, everyone, that caps it off for this show, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow. Thanks for watching.